You're standing on the open tundra of Ice Age Siberia. It's minus 40 degrees. The wind hasn't stopped for 3 days, dragging loose snow sideways across a landscape with no trees, no caves, no cover for 100 kilometers in any direction. And somewhere out there, the fire your group has kept burning for years just went out. No lighter, no matches, no guarantee you'll get another one lit before the cold finishes the job. Welcome to the single narrowest survival margin our species has ever pulled off. Because here's the thing, the title of this video is hiding from you a little. By the time humans were actually living through the worst of the Ice Age, deep in Siberia, at the edge of the ice sheets, they did have fire, they did have clothing, they did have shelter. What they didn't have was a safety margin. Every one of those three things could fail, all at once, in a place where failure meant death within hours. And for most of our species' deep past, before any of that technology existed at all, humans didn't have those tools, even in their fragile, failure-prone form. They had nothing but a body. So this is the real story, not humans casually strolling through the Ice Age with perfect gear. It's humans clawing their way into the coldest, most hostile climate our species has ever lived in, one failure-prone technology and one biological trick at a time. Long before fire or clothing were reliable, the body itself had to do the heavy lifting. And the clearest example of this is Neanderthals. Neanderthals lived through repeated glacial cycles in Ice Age Europe for over 300,000 years, and their skeletons show it. Short limbs, barrel-shaped compact torsos, wide noses with large internal cavities built to warm and humidify freezing air before it ever reached the lungs. This isn't random. It follows two well-documented biological rules. Bergmann's rule. In colder climates, bodies trend rounder and bulkier because a compact shame has less surface area relative to its volume, which means less area to lose heat from. Allen's rule. Limbs get shorter for the same reason. Less exposed surface, less heat bleeding out into the air. Cold-adapted human populations show these same patterns today, just less extreme than Neanderthals. Evolution was already trying to solve the cold problem in the body, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone figured out how to sew a coat. And there's a second biological trick working underneath the skin: brown adipose tissue, or brown fat. Unlike regular fat, which just stores energy, brown fat burns it directly to generate heat, no shivering required. Human infants are loaded with it. Adults in cold climates retain more of it than adults in warm ones. It's a built-in space heater, running quietly in the background, buying time before any external technology enters the picture at all. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Some of the earliest hominins to leave Africa entirely, over 1.8 million years ago, pushed into the temperate hills of the Caucasus at a site called Dmanisi in modern Georgia. And the evidence for controlled fire use at that site, and at most sites from that era, is essentially absent. These early humans were moving into colder, harsher terrain than anything their ancestors had faced, without the one tool we now consider absolutely essential to surviving cold. So, how did they manage it at all? Almost certainly through a mix of things that had nothing to do with technology. Seasonal movement, avoiding the harshest months by tracking food and mild terrain. Natural shelter, caves, rock overhangs, dense brush used as windbreaks, and opportunistic fire, not fire they could create on demand, but fire they could scavenge and briefly maintain from natural sources like wildfires or volcanic activity, long before anyone had a reliable method of starting one from scratch. The controlled, deliberate use of fire only becomes clearly, consistently visible in the archaeological record around 400,000 years ago, at multiple sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Reliable fire starting, the ability to make a new fire on demand rather than just keeping an existing one alive, is even more recent. Strike-alike kits using flint and pyrite show up clearly only around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, which means for well over 1 million years of human and pre-human history, cold survival rested almost entirely on the body and on behavior. Fire, when it was available at all, was something you protected like your most valuable possession, because losing it could mean not getting another one for a very long time. Even once fire-making became reliable, it did not mean the danger was solved. It meant a new constant job appeared: keeping it alive. Fire needs fuel, and on the open steppe tundra of Ice Age Siberia and Ukraine, during the coldest stretch of the last glacial period, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, there were almost no trees. Wood, the fuel modern people default to imagining, was scarce or completely absent across huge stretches of the terrain humans were now living in. So people burned what was actually available: animal bone, dried dung, fat-soaked material. Bone burns differently than wood. It needs a hotter initial flame to sustain combustion, which means fires had to be actively managed and fed with real skill, not just lit and left alone. And a fire that goes out in a blizzard at -40 degrees with the nearest fuel source buried under snow and the nearest ember hours away is not a minor inconvenience. It's a life-threatening emergency. This is very likely part of why groups kept watch in shifts through the night. Someone was always awake, and part of that person's job was making sure the fire never actually died. Now let's talk about clothing, because there's a massive difference between draping an animal hide over your shoulders and what Ice Age humans eventually built. And that difference is the actual reason humans could survive the Arctic at all. A draped hide blocks wind and holds in a little warmth, but it leaves gaps. Cold air gets in at the neck, the wrists, the legs. In genuinely extreme cold, gaps like that are the difference between surviving the night and not. The real breakthrough was the eye needle. Fine needles with a small hole for thread, made from bone and ivory, start appearing in the archaeological record roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, with some of the earliest known examples coming from sites in Siberia near the Denisova region. An eyed needle means you can sew, not just wrap an animal skin around your body, but cut it, shape it, and stitch multiple layered pieces into fitted garments, sleeves, hoods, tightly closed seams that don't let wind through. This is the difference between a blanket and a coat. At a site called Sungir in modern Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found burials with thousands of ivory beads arranged in patterns that only make sense as decoration sewn directly onto fitted clothing, an entire tailored outfit, beaded from head to foot, that had long since decayed, leaving only the pattern of beads behind to show exactly where the seams and layers had been. This technology is very likely what made it possible for modern humans to push all the way into the Arctic. At a site called Yana, in far northern Siberia, above the Arctic Circle, archaeologists have found evidence of humans living there roughly around 32,000 years ago, in one of the coldest inhabited environments on the planet at the time. Without fitted, layered, wind-sealed clothing, that settlement is almost impossible to imagine. The needle, a tool smaller than your finger, may be one of the single most important survival inventions in the entire history of our species. Shelter faced the exact same problem as fire: no wood. So on the open steppe tundra, people built with the only large structurally useful material actually available: mammoth bone. At a site called Mezherich in modern Ukraine, dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered the remains of dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Skulls stacked to form a foundation, tusks arched overhead like structural beams, the whole frame likely covered in hides for insulation and weatherproofing. Building one of these structures wasn't a one-person job. It took a coordinated group sourcing bones from multiple mammoth carcasses, likely scavenged and hunted over an extended period, and physically assembling something that had to survive brutal winds and heavy snow load. It's a genuinely remarkable engineering solution. When the environment takes away your obvious building material, you don't stop building, you use what's actually standing in front of you. Even if what's standing in front of you is the skeleton of the largest land animal on the continent. Here's the piece that often gets left out of the fire and clothing story entirely. None of this worked if you were by yourself. Body heat, sharing. multiple people sleeping in close physical contact inside a small enclosed shelter, is a measurable, meaningful source of warmth. A single sleeping human generates a continuous amount of body heat. Multiply that by 4 or 6 people packed into a mammoth-bone dwelling, covered in hides, and the internal temperature of that space rises in a way that one person alone could never achieve. Group size mattered for a second reason too. Someone had to tend the fire through the night. Someone had to repair torn clothing before the next hunt. Someone had to process new hides fast enough to replace worn-out gear. In brutal cold, all of these jobs are constant and unforgiving, and no single person can do all of them and still get enough rest to survive. Cold didn't just test the body and the technology. It tested the group. Isolation, in this environment, wasn't just lonely, it was frequently fatal. So how did humans survive Ice Age winters with no fire, no clothes, and no shelter? The honest answer is, for most of our deep past, they mostly didn't have to, because they simply avoided the coldest extremes, sticking to milder latitudes their bodies could already handle. But when humans finally did push into the harshest cold our planet had to offer, the ice sheets of the last glacial period, the Arctic tundra above the circle, they didn't do it with a finished toolkit. They did it by stacking one fragile advantage on top of another. A body already partly shaped by evolution for the cold, fire that had to be guarded like a life itself, clothing that only became truly effective once someone invented a needle small enough to fit between 2 fingers, shelter built from the bones of the biggest animal on the continent because the trees simply weren't there. And running underneath every single one of those pieces was something that doesn't show up in the archaeological record as clearly as a needle or a bone wall, but mattered just as much. Other people. Nobody did this alone. The cold didn't just test biology and technology. It tested whether a group of humans could depend on each other enough, consistently enough, for years, without a single fatal gap. We've talked before about how losing our fur forced humans to trade biology for invention. This is the same trade playing out at the most extreme edge biology and invention have ever been pushed to. And somehow, one fragile, failure-prone piece at a time, it held.